We're going to have a fireside chat. This is one of our Centimillionaire fireside chats with Joel Nagel. So you do not want to miss this. And related to Mark's topic about writing books, I've put out 13 books, and people sometimes say, why would you want to write another book? Well, each time we do and provide more value, it helps our business grow. So that's why we want to do it. But we like doing these fireside chats. We try to do at least one of these at every event, sometimes two or three. It kind of mixes up the day, so it's not a whole bunch of panels and standalones only. And today we have with us Joel Nagel. And sometimes people have these long bios, and when I start a podcast, sometimes people read off my whole bio, and it's almost an embarrassment because it takes so long for them to read it off. I feel like I should have shortened it. But there are some bullet points I want to share with Joel, about Joel, that I think add context to this, and I think are really important to note. Too many for me to have memorized, so I jotted down a couple of them, even though I know Joel pretty well now and know his family. So besides being a leading international asset protection expert, he's done work in 43 countries over 34 years. He's never had a federal agency or a U.S. corporation court penetrate one of the offshore trusts. So if you want to have a nest egg that is protected offshore, good person to know. Mike Cobb and him founded ECI Real Estate Development in 1996. That was about when I was getting that internship to make websites for that Indian fellow I mentioned earlier. So he's been at this quite some time. They own 4,000 acres in Central America, $130 million of real estate assets. In 2003, he founded an international bank in Belize. He's the chairman and founder of that bank. They just had their 20-year anniversary when I was speaking at one of his events recently. They're announcing that. He's served on 30 different boards. To understand his influence, he has residencies in Pennsylvania, in Belize, where he's been a diplomat of Belize. Not many people have diplomat passports, and in the history of the world, there's only been a very finite number of diplomats that have ever lived. And I know Joel will probably tell us that number in just a minute. He mentioned it on stage recently. But I find that really fascinating. There's probably not another diplomat here in the room. And above everything else, like I said earlier, we're just trying to find really great people who can share great things with the audience, and Joel's a real example of that. So we're honored to have him here with us today, and I think you'll enjoy this fireside chat. If we get done early enough, we'll take a quick question or two, but otherwise I'm sure he'll be gracious enough to answer questions afterwards and this evening, etc. So why don't we jump into it, and anything I missed, anything you want to correct me on? Do you know the number of diplomats?
Was quite the introduction. I would just retort by saying that I speak at conferences all over the world, and no one puts on a better conference than you do, Richard. So let's give Richard a round of applause.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Joel. And how many diplomats total has there been? Do you still have that number top of mind?
Yeah, I think since the time of Jesus, it's about 40,000. So
40,000, yeah. 7 billion people in the world now.
Exactly.
Right? So, great. Well, so what's your secret to success? You're obviously a serial entrepreneur who has done things at a greater scale and success level than most people in your field.
Well, to me, first of all, I always wanted to try to be different than everybody around me. We're at an investment conference. I speak at a lot of investment conferences, and everybody's trying to tell you how to make money. So, I show up at investment conferences and tell people how to save and protect, preserve, and pass on what they already have. So, I try to make myself a little bit different. I've also really leveraged over the years my legal background, first to serve people, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's a profession. So you're serving people, and the more comfortable they feel with you, the more they want to bring you into their sphere. That's how I ended up on 30 different corporate boards. Had the opportunity to co-invest. One of the first things I got involved with was a investment bank almost 30 years ago, and there were a lot of very wealthy people in this bank, and I helped set it up and I helped operate it. And the minimum investment size was, I don't know, for any particular investment was $500,000 or $1 million. And I said, hey, I'd really like to, co-invest with you guys, but, I don't have that much money. And they said, well, how much money do you have? And I said, well, this one thing you're investing in, I'd really like to participate. Well, how much money do you have? And I said, well, I think I could scratch together $10,000. And the one guy said, oh, he just had his first kid. Let him do it. Well, a couple years later, my investment in that bank was worth $4 million. So, being in the room with the right people, they're going to bend over backwards for you if they feel that you're bending over backwards for them. So for me, when I represent a client, that's my universe, the sun rises and sets around that client. I want to do everything possible, assuming what they're doing is legal, moral, ethical, and I'm at the stage of my career where I don't take clients that don't meet that basic criteria. But assuming they do, then I give everything I can to help them achieve their goals and objectives, and usually it does come back around.
Awesome. So there's probably 1,000 words of wisdom there, but one word was making people comfortable, the word comfortable. And I think that you don't come off as a hardcore Wall Street salesman that's going to eat someone's children for breakfast. We've had no conversations where there was awkwardness or stress or pressure or something strange about it. And sometimes in the investment industry, people are very intense. And so obviously that's played into your success. Can you talk about that? Are you just naturally pretty relaxed and that's the type of character you are and you've just done well and that's how you naturally are? Or how much of that have you learned to emphasize or be even more slow paced so people trust you and they don't feel rushed or something?
Yeah, look, when I'm involved in like my own businesses, I'm sure some of my employees would say I'm not that easygoing and relaxed, but first of all, you take the client where you find them, and you're always trying to improve where they are. You're trying to help them, trying to get them to the next level. In many cases, their businesses themselves are very successful, and they don't need me for their success. But now they start thinking about, generational wealth stewardship. How am I going to, protect and preserve and pass on my wealth to my kids, my grandkids? And yeah, that really should be slowed down a little bit. Like there's no rush. Frequently we will get calls on December 29th and someone will say, hey, can we get this all done by the 31st? We'll run around like chickens with our heads cut off if we need to, but that's not normally the way you want to do. You want to take your time, relax, get to know people, get to understand. In Latin America, they say measure twice, cut once. That's what we really want to do. When we start with a new client, we really start by just asking them a million questions about themselves, because I'm not really qualified to give you advice on anything if I don't understand your situation first. So, and I think that shows through. The clients understand that we really do want to know and understand their situation, and that's what creates the connection in the first place.
Awesome. Yeah, I think you do have to ask a lot of questions to customize something that makes sense, whether you're an attorney or someone designing an investment solution. And our private investor playbook has 40 questions you should ask yourself or ask a client before you create a family office for them. That's along that same line. But we often have the fireside chats with people that I'm trying to be more like Paul Karger managing $8.5 billion at 45 years old. Jeff Hoffman, a billionaire, is going to do the fireside chat at our next summit. And then you're here. There's other people here in the room that would like to be like you when they grow up as well. And part of our business is running an investor club, but we want to evolve and have that turn into an equivalent of you founding a bank 20 years ago or the real estate development firm 23 years ago, et cetera, more than 23 years ago. So what advice do you have on having one thing that's successful and then timing and finding the natural path of maybe having one or two offshoots that turn into major offshoots versus a side experiment or something that's just truly passive? Any lessons you've learned the hard way over 30 plus years doing that?
Sure. Not everything we've ever done has worked out for sure, but one, building a team, I'm the first to say, I can't take credit for anything. Everything, involves a team. Our bank, for example, we just received an award for the best bank in CARICOM, which is all of the Caribbean region. It took us 20 years to earn that award. There's no overnight, magic fairy dust that's going to get you there. I would say, whatever your primary objective is, you have to focus without any distraction, interruption. As a young lawyer, one of the things that happened to me a lot, you're trying to get your practice up and off the ground. You're trying to make ends meet. You have rent to pay. You have a wife. You have little kids at home, and you have this natural tendency to take any piece of business that comes along. And I really resisted that. I knew the lane I wanted to be in. I focused on that. When I had extra time, I wrote articles, contacted conferences, and said, hey, do you need a speaker to come and talk about asset protection? And, that's how I used my extra time. And, over time, it really paid off. It's like a snowball. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And, I was telling Richard the other day, one of my friends told me, you have an amazing law practice because you have an unlimited marketing budget that you don't have to pay for. It's called, how screwed up the U.S. is. And basically, more than half the people are always upset all the time. And, once you're upset, you're worried about things. You're thinking about maybe making an investment overseas, maybe picking up a passport somewhere or a residence somewhere. You start thinking about these things. and then it's not that hard to, to find me and my number. And so the phones really do ring all day. I can tell you, I have a secretary. She literally does nothing but answer the phone all day. And I'm always kind of amazed and perplexed, like, where do all these people come from?
Sure. Well, it's obviously working. I know when we had our Centimillionaire Strategies event in Vienna this summer, we had a member of the Habsburg family, which, if you're not familiar, the person who came and spoke would be like the prince, or would be the reigning member of the family for the whole country, if that still existed there. We also went and my daughter got to flip the coin on TV, the coin toss for the Vikings football game, which she loved. And so you're obviously very influential and tied into a lot of people. But when you meet somebody who's worth $30 million or $100 million plus, how do you really start that relationship and earn it? Do you treat them different? Do you treat every single client the same? Is there a go-to strategy or two that just really works that we haven't already talked about related to getting people comfortable?
I mean, I think one of the earlier speakers said something about, billionaire walks in the room and he's the funniest person, the most intelligent person. I had an extremely wealthy uncle. He was short, fat, and bald, and he used to say, the more money he had, the taller he got, the more handsome he got, and the more hair he had on his head. So, that's sort of a natural inclination on the one hand. I would say I resist that. My overriding tendency is to just try to treat everyone as a client, and that means getting to know them, as on a personal level, to the extent that they'll let me, in. Some people don't. Some people maintain a wall of facade around them. They just want you to have certain bits of information. The more information we have, the better job we can do for people. And I think they understand that, so they tend to maybe let us in more than they would a salesperson, investment advisor. People do understand that they have something called attorney-client privilege with their lawyer. So, they'll even end up telling us things that we probably don't want to know. They'll tell us things that they probably wouldn't tell their spouse or, their priest or whatever. But, I think it's developing that interpersonal relationship, and then that goes a long way, everywhere else.
Sure. Yeah. Joel is so humble and low-key about all the success he's had that it wasn't until meeting with him for the second or third time that I realized when he mentioned like this bank or the real estate company, it was like something he fully owned, and it was this big thing that he had developed. And it's kind of the opposite approach that some people take on presenting themselves. So what about closing a client? Does it naturally in your industry just come in and they have this impetus to get going and they have this deadline? Or do you use a certain approach and say, well, based on everything we said, do you want to sign? Do you want to get started this week? Do you have a closing approach, or does it just happen so naturally you don't even think about it?
Well, we don't have a closing approach in the sense of, like a traditional sales cycle. We try to help, we try to educate, speak at conferences, write articles. Usually, people kind of know when they come to us. Sometimes they're not in a hurry, like, hey, look, it can drag out 6 months, a year. This is something I want to do. It's generational. Other times it's like, oh my gosh, I'm worried that, I might be getting sued and like I need to get something set up, yesterday. So we're in that regard, we're more reactive. We're not really proactive. We have enough people knocking on the door that there's never a need like, oh gosh, we need 3 new clients this month. It just doesn't work like that.
Sure, makes sense. So in a second, I'm going to ask you to let the audience know what like the number 1 or 2 or top 3 facts about global asset protection are. But I've heard Joel speak 4 or 5 times on the topic. There's one thing that always got my attention, is that he said in the olden days, 20 years ago, people thought about global asset protection as hide and seek. And now it's show and tell. If someone comes and looks, you say, this is what we have. Here's a structure. It's all above board. Feel free to audit it 10 times over if you want. Everything was done open book. And it's not, let me hide my assets in Panama, or let me hide it here, and then they pay 0 taxes. Joel always says, I don't want to see you wearing orange one day, and I won't work with you if you request me to do something that's going to maybe put you in that position, because that also comes back on him. And that really stood out to me. So what do you think is most, important to communicate to the crowd about global asset protection?
Well, frequently we'll talk to somebody and, they'll have an idea or suggestion that does cross the line, and I'll say, well, look, if you want to violate the law, you don't need me. You don't need a lawyer to break the law. You need a lawyer to help you, stay within the law. I had a journalist call me up when the Panama Papers broke, and they were like, oh, are you worried on behalf of your clients? I said, no, absolutely not. And, it's because, for every transaction we do for clients, We do the proper legal reporting. If we set up a trust, there's a filing that goes along with that. There's a gift tax return. There's a return that goes along with setting up a foreign corporation. And sometimes, the pendulum swings too far the other way. I've had clients say, well, I wanted to do this, but my lawyer, my CPA said it was illegal. I'm like, what's illegal? Oh, they said setting up an offshore company was illegal. I'm like, wow, well, there's like 15 different forms I have to fill out for the IRS when I set up a company for you overseas. I mean, it would be unlikely that they would have all this paperwork if it was, illegal to do in the first place. So the main thing is just, I think what you said, show and tell. It is actually the show and tell attitude that intimidates would-be plaintiffs. It intimidates, government, agencies. I can tell you the first year of my practice, this was back in like 1990, we did some work for a client, and then all of a sudden we got a letter from U.S. District Attorney, U.S. Assistant Attorney, asking for information about a client. Well, that totally freaked me out, right? Because you have attorney-client privilege, and I, really didn't know what to do. There was a mentor program through the Bar Association, and I called this lawyer. He was this like 85-year-old, raspy, New York Jewish lawyer, the whole accent and everything, and I explained the situation. He said, let me tell you, here's what you're going to do. And basically what he said is, call the U.S. attorney back and you say, look, I'm more than happy to cooperate with you. We're very much an open book, but obviously we have attorney-client relationship, attorney-client privilege. But if you go to the court and ask the judge to get a subpoena, then I'll gladly honor any subpoena. I'm not going to fight the subpoena. Get a subpoena, I'll turn over the documents. Well, they recognize the fact that no judge is going to, allow a government agency to just, waltz into a law firm and take their records. So they backed down and went away. And a few other times in my career, it popped back up again. I used the exact same strategy. And so I've never turned over information. I've never, had a government agency tenacious enough to try to fight through that attorney-client privilege. Clients sometimes will say to me, hey, is this, what if the NSA is listening to our call? I'm like, well, what if they are? I mean, they eavesdropped on the Chancellor of Germany. I mean, I can't stop them from eavesdropping on me. But, there's some Supreme Court rulings. One's called the fruit of the poison tree. Means if a government agency does something like that that's illegal, then it can't be used, against you in any kind of process or proceeding. So, that's really the attitude we take. Do things the right way, the legal way, the transparent way, and that's really what's going to give you the protection going forward.
Awesome. Yeah, one example Joel told at one of the events was that let's say you back over somebody's $1 million, show dog and kill the dog, and someone tries to have an action against you and your assets are in a trust and belize or whatnot. Their action would be potentially against you, not the trust and Belize. They could fly down to Belize and try to file local documents against the trust, and they would say, what did the trust do? Did the trust run over your dog? No. So correct me if I'm wrong, but that's one example of like how some of this works, right? Like very simplified.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good example. I mean, when you create a trust or a foundation in a place like Liechtenstein, Nevis, Belize, Cook Islands, these types of jurisdictions, these are not neutral jurisdictions. We all agree the U.S. is a pro-plaintiff jurisdiction. We're the most pro-plaintiff jurisdiction in the world. And then people say, well, are you trying to find equilibrium? Are you trying to find a neutral jurisdiction? And I say, absolutely not. I mean, neutral jurisdictions really exist. In my view, the British system is very, very neutral. And I could go into that for a lot of reasons. But we're the opposite. We're trying to find jurisdictions that are very pro-defense. So in a pro-defense jurisdiction, what they're essentially doing through their legislation is they're saying, it's not enough to have a cause of action against me. You have to have a cause of action against the entity or the structure itself. So the question becomes, well, what did that structure ever do to you? They weren't involved in whatever the issue or the problem is. So as long as the trust is holding assets in sort of a passive way, even active businesses, if they're under a corporate structure, trust can do that. And really that's how you perpetuate wealth. You hold assets. You avoid the generational gift and estate tax, allow these assets to grow, and by doing that, you can avoid those certain types of taxes, not income tax, but gift and estate tax, and you can really allow assets to grow for 2, 3, 4 generations.
Great, thank you. So we're a couple questions away from taking questions from the audience. So if you want to raise your hand, we can bring a microphone over to you just to kind of get those going here in just a minute. One other thing I learned while listening to Joel is just that if you wait till there's big storm clouds above you, it's too late to go to him for an umbrella. You cannot say, oh, a car's about, some crash is about to happen in my life, someone might come after me, I better form some structures real quick. So you want to be setting this stuff up before there's a problem, is one thing I've learned. If you want to expand on that, Joel, it'd be great, but also just kind of what dollar amount makes sense. Like if someone has 5 million net worth, a 10 million net worth, 20 million, like at what level does it make sense to start working with you since you've worked with so many clients?
Yeah, I'll take the second part first and then circle back. I mean, look, we don't have any litmus test, and I think what we try to do is come up with, proportional structures that make sense. We're not going to suggest a very complex structure or strategy to somebody that's got $500,000. But there's still certainly strategies that you can make at that level. We even work with entrepreneurs that are concerned about, their business that they're creating. They think they're going to be the next, Microsoft or Apple or whatever, and essentially their company's worth nothing at the moment. But you know what? That's actually the best time to do asset protection and estate planning, because I can move the value of I can move those shares themselves into a structure that protects it, preserves it, passes it on to future generations, and I don't have to worry about a tax implication. Whereas if I wait until that company becomes worth millions or potentially billions of dollars, there would be a huge tax consequence.
Sure, great. And I do see we have our first question back by John, which we'll take in just a second. If anyone else has a question too, just raise your hand and we'll try to bring a mic to you.
But just
as well.
touching really fast on the, you do want to do this type of planning before there's a problem. There's under common law going back, centuries, you get into this concept called a fraudulent conveyance. If somebody sues you, it's too late. You can't run out and say, oh, I'm going to create a structure. You can't call me because I'm not going to help you. Why? Because then it's conspiracy to commit fraud, and I'm not your lawyer anymore. I'm a co-conspirator. So you have to do this type of planning when the sun's shining, when the skies are blue. And if you do it that way, then when the storm clouds roll in later, and let's face it, we're all going to face storm clouds throughout life, through business, personal issues are going to arise. And so it's for those moments in time that you're creating the kind of planning and structures now.
Awesome. And then what $1 million insight can you give the audience related to getting deals done, whether it's acquiring 1,000 acres in Central America, doing a joint venture with someone, growing your bank over 30 years? Like, what's like one of the biggest insights you could share with the room that you think would be relevant that hasn't been talked about at this event, yet you think enough maybe?
Well, for me, I always want to be somewhere that's where the masses don't want to be. And I mean, that's not a super unique thing. I think a lot of investment people speak in those terms. So, as a lawyer, I don't want to be doing what all the other lawyers are doing in the real estate business. Mike was talking earlier about, for example, our Teak plantation. I mean, we bought a giant cow pasture that had been totally deforested, and then it had been farmed until, it could no longer be farmed, and there were literally cracks in the ground. And, it looked terrible. It looked like it was about to turn into desert. And, we talked to some people that were in that industry, and we said, hey, can we actually grow a forest here of teak? And they said, well, on the edge of the property, there's a river, and you have the river rights. We bought that property for nothing, almost nothing. And like Mike said, the element we were prepared to give up was time. So, it was this little snowball, not worth anything, and then it was worth more and more and more and more. And now it's worth a substantial amount of money. And you can go Google what a board foot of teak wood is, and you'll see. So, it wasn't that hard to do. It was thinking with a different time horizon, a little bit different lens. We were already in the space with our real estate development company. And we came across this opportunity. It wasn't ideal for building houses, but it was ideal for planting trees. The beautiful thing about trees, by the way, is they don't go on strike. They're not affected by war, famine. Teak actually needs a drought, so if it doesn't rain for 3 or 4 months, that's great. So it was a good business for us.
Awesome. Yeah, my talk earlier today was average equals death. That's the last thing you want to be. And you've said multiple times during this fireside chat. And Joel didn't even want to see the questions I was asking. His son said, yeah, Joel read the first one. He's like, you know what? It'd be more genuine if we just answer him off the cuff and just say the true answers versus trying to answer him like a politician or something. So
I'll mess him up if I try to do it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you already are a politician too, so you're natural, right? So, but yeah, that's something we try to reemphasize all the time. And we talk about that at our masterminds. Don't do what everyone else is doing. Stand out, be different, unique. So it's awesome that came out naturally. So John, let's get to the person that has a question by you, and then we have time for a couple more questions. If anyone has one, we'll bring the mic over to you next.
Thank you. My name is Pierre DuPont, and Richard, thank you very much for the good questions, and Joel for your great answers. I loved in particular your comment a moment ago about setting up dynasty trusts. I am the very fortunate beneficiary of far less than $1 million worth of value to me of a generational trust set up more than 100 years ago, which I share with 250 other people. Take any large number, divide by 250, it's pretty small. My question for you is, when you set up a dynasty trust, what do you suggest, what do you do typically about family governance and oversight of the trust that will cross those 100 years? Any comments on the governance and so on?
Yeah, that's a really great question. When you transfer assets to an asset protection trust, you're actually giving up you're giving up the legal ownership of the asset. Having said that, the trustee, a bank, trust company, whoever is the trustee, they're in business to serve you, to serve your family. So, they're going to follow not only the written language of the document that we draft for you as lawyers, but generally they're very open to something called a memorandum of wishes. And that's where you're sort of laying out in a first person way your philosophy. Like, hey, if my kid turns into a druggie, I don't want them to get a distribution from the trust because, at that point the money is just going to be used to hurt or injure themselves. And the nice thing about that, not only does it guide the trustee, but, if somebody starts challenging the trust, normally the trustee can pull this out and say, well, look, your grandfather set up this trust 20 years ago. You should really read this. And when that person reads the firsthand letter from their grandfather saying, well, this is the circumstance where I want people to get money, this is where I don't want them to get money, it usually makes it harder for them to say, oh, I want to sue the trust because they're, not looking out for my interests. In fact, they see that the trust is looking out exactly for their interests because the trust's, job is to follow what the grantor initially wanted in the first place. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, great question, Pierre. I couldn't recognize you from here at the bright lights, but I appreciate that. And we might do we're doing this next gen series on YouTube soon, a mini series, and maybe we can kind of use this as part of that. So what would be something that you could share with the room about next gen planning that you've learned with your own family? I know you think about that quite a bit. Any insights or things you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, in the last panel, somebody was talking, or a few panels ago, they were talking about, being born in one circumstance and then, their children are now in a different circumstance. I mean, I grew up, I was really just a poor farm kid, honestly, from Western Pennsylvania. Never had two nickels to rub together. And, I always thought when I was little, it'd be so cool if someday I could be a millionaire. Well, I've more than exceeded that many times over. And, I think one of the other speakers said something about you want what's best for your children. And of course I want what's best for my children. I sent them to the best private schools. I wanted to make sure they had every advantage in life. But having said that, I don't want them to turn into, trust fund babies who are laying around on yachts at 3 o'clock in the afternoon getting stoned and drunk, right? So, I think moderating what wealth they have access to, having them come alongside. Two of my boys work in our businesses. One of them, my son Joe, is here. He jokingly at the VIP dinner last night said, as second generation, his job is to, fix the, the computer, the IT, the password resets and all that. It's not really true. He does way more than that. But, I think it really is about making sure that they understand that, one, the advantages that they've had. My oldest son, for example, graduated from medical school, and, he's in his residency right now. And he called me up one day and he said, Dad, I've never really properly thanked you. I said, what for, Jimmy? And he said, well, I was talking to a group of my friends, and they were all telling me about how much student loan debt they have. And these guys are telling me they have $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in student debt. And, they basically have a mortgage and no house. And he said, I really appreciate what you've done for me by letting me start life without, any debt. And I said, well, great. So now, you have the capacity to make a lot of money. So, don't come in and ask me for any more. So it's, it really is trying to, teach them, get them to the next level themselves. And, I think having self-worth, value. And for me personally, I will also say, having two of my sons work in my business has been one of the most interesting things for me. I mean, I've achieved every single financial goal that I ever set out to do. I could have retired 5 years, 10 years ago. And working with them is, for me, the most important thing. It gives joy to my day to come to work. I love, imparting what I know to them, seeing them sort of take the mantle. And, the real estate company that we started, it really is a 100-year company. I mean, we have thousands of acres all over Central America. I'm never going to develop it all. My kids probably aren't even going to develop it all. It's probably their kids. So, trying to introduce them to these concepts and then seeing what their natural inclination is, because they all tend, when opportunity presents itself, they all kind of go in different directions. So my biggest goal is just to try to encourage them and then allow them to, embrace things, what makes sense for them.
Sure. Great. Well, let's see, we have 40 seconds here, but if there's a question by John here, we'll take it real quick in 15, 20 seconds, try to get a quick answer, and we might be able to run the mic over for one last question here if we do them both real quick.
Quick question, just the difference between, you mentioned about the offshore trust, and I have a friend of mine who has a couple $100 million fund, and he mentioned a specific trust to me under common law, and you deal with that type of trust? Because he was telling me not a lot of U.S. attorneys deal with that type of trust.
I'm not sure I got the question.
Difference between a dynasty trust and an offshore trust, I think was part of the question.
He calls it it's called discretionary, irrevocable, non-grantor, spendthrift common law trust.
Sounds like a simple question.
Yeah, no, I'd be very happy to speak with you in more depth afterwards. But let me just say briefly, in this group, one of the, when we set up any kind of structure offshore internationally, what we're really doing, imagine it's jurisdiction shopping on steroids. Why do people set up companies in Delaware? Why do people move to Florida? There's a real or perceived benefit. Well, the same thing is true in the international world. And in a lot of jurisdictions, they've completely ended statutorily the notion that a trust can only be for a certain fixed period of time, like 2 generations or 50 years. So you have jurisdictions that say, hey, it's your money. You paid tax on it. It's legal. If you want to lock it up in a dynasty trust for the next 1,000 years, you have the right to do that. So, when we have clients that want those types of structures, then we're going to tend to sort of set up those structures in jurisdictions that permit that kind of that kind of trust structure. But again, I think your question was more nuanced than that, so I'd be happy to talk to you more afterwards.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. And we are a little bit over, so we'll just have you answer this gentleman's question maybe after the fireside chat. But let's give Joel a big round of applause.
Thank you, Richard.